Over the last few months, we've seen explosive movements on a global scale, from Colombia to Myanmar to the recent protests in solidarity with Palestine. We're seeing a worldwide awakening on the issue of struggle and repression on a worldwide scale. But also in many of these countries, there will be events that require socialists, worker activists, fighters on the left to rally in defense of and in solidarity with those facing repression today. And this is why at this meeting we've got two very special guests. We have Lance and Vincent Colo. Lance and Vincent are both Marxists that have worked on the ground building the forces of socialism in China and Hong Kong. Currently, they have to take extreme precautions in the face of the ongoing crackdown against democracy activists in the region. But we all look very much forward to hearing more from them. So with all that being said, the first speaker that I'm going to bring in is Lance, who is one of our activists and members in ChinaWorker.info, which is the section of the International Socialist Alternative in China.
Our campaign, Solidarity Against Repression in China and Hong Kong, has been set up because in China, state repression is accelerating, with the vicious authoritarian crackdown in Hong Kong being a part of this wider process. One reason the so-called communist or CCP regime, led by Xi Jinping, is doing so is because it needs to show strength against US and Western US-China imperialist conflict or new Cold War. This is not only to warn foreign governments. There are power struggles inside the CCP regime, and Xi Jinping needs to show a hard line against his rivals. And above all, Xi Jinping's regime where the mass struggle for democratic rights can spread to China. Xi Jinping has to use Han nationalist, racist, and chauvinist policies to divert public anger from the real causes of increasingly economic, political, and social problems. Solidarity Against Repression in China and Hong Kong is a unique campaign because it links socialists and activists internationally with socialists in China and Hong Kong. China now faces a serious population crisis. Last month, the government released its population census. It says China's population kept growing and is now 1.41 billion. Many people don't believe the official data. It's impossible that the population increased by over 10 million last year. Some even suspect China's population is already in decline. Births in 2020 is 12 million, which is the lowest since 1961, which was the end of the Great Famine. For 35 years, China had a one-child policy. It was illegal to have more than one child, even though the restrictions on birth were loosened in 2016, and now all married couples are allowed to have a maximum of 3 children. It's not likely this will reverse the decline in births. A poll about the new 3-child policy showed 93% thought it would not encourage people to have more children. The poll was removed from news sites the same day. The announcement of the 3-child policy last week reflects that the CCP regime is panicking. The birth rate per woman is 1.3, well below 2.1 needed to maintain the population. The population is also aging. And India, which has a much younger population structure, will soon overtake China to become the most populous country. The labor force in the world factory is shrinking for 8 straight years and will continue to shrink. This will become more troublesome for Xi Jinping and in the context of historic US-China rivalry. The biggest factor that prevents couples from having children is the punitive cost of having a child in China. The healthcare is not the same as that in most developed countries, so the cost for medication can be very high. The most developed cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen have one of the most expensive housing in the world. If parents want to let their children receive high-quality education, it means the cost will also be high. Outside China, there are misunderstandings that there are still leftovers of the old so-called socialist Maoist era before capitalist restoration. But housing was privatized in the 1990s. There is no free healthcare or education. Pensions and unemployment insurance are extremely low. When the official media released the news of a three-child policy, many netizens correctly pointed out that there must be a pay rise for workers and substantial increase in welfare, or most people can't afford to have children. There is massive anger against 996 working hour system, which means employees work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days per week. This is becoming increasingly normal for many companies, especially for the young people. Young people in China have become exhausted by such a hard work culture, while they get little reward. Therefore, many of them are highlighting the need for a lifestyle change by lying flat. There is a new mass trend in China. This is a new mass trend in China, and the government is very worried. Lying flat means people shouldn't buy a house, buy a car, get married, or have children. They should have an austere consumption and refuse to work overtime so they won't be slaves exploited by their bosses. This philosophy is a mix of ideas, including non-corporations, but also some elements of anti-capitalism and hatred of 996 culture. CCP regime doesn't want to see this developing, as popularization of lying flat philosophy can inhibit the growth of productivity, but also domestic consumption, and can be a threat to Xi Jinping's regime's schemes of making China a global superpower. CCP-controlled media outlets have criticized the lying flat, but most netizens reject their criticism. An online poll by a pro-CCP media shows 60% of netizens have sympathy with or even support lying flat. Today, the CCP is already an extremely conservative and reactionary party, especially under Xi Jinping. It can be comparable with the right wing of Tories or US Republicans, so it won't put forward socialist policies to tackle the population crisis, but now promotes heterosexual marriage and the so-called family values as an important control unit to assure political and social stability. Accordingly, women must be obedient so they can give birth to the next generation of the oppressed to reproduce the working class. The CCP's reactionary family politics is related to a series of attacks on feminism and women's rights in China. In January, China's education ministry launched a new policy to prevent the feminization of male adolescents. The new policy aims to cultivate students' masculinity. Another matter of attacks on feminism has been reported in one of the ChinaWorkers.info's articles. Comrades may have read that piece. The CCP fears that growing support for feminism as it fears all social processes outside control, and its policy aims for the economy and to challenge the US globally are threatened if women don't have more babies. CCP regime has been implementing Han supremacist national policies. For example, since 2014, Xi's regime has also implemented ultra-repressive policies in Xinjiang. Racist policies discriminate against Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities. So-called extreme names like Mohammed, the world's most common male names, are banned from newborn children. Uyghur communities have been forcibly relocated and their towns torn down. Their Uyghur language is no longer allowed in the education system and is also banned in some public places. 1 to 3 million children, mainly Muslim Uyghurs, but also other non-Han ethnic groups such as Kazakhs and Kyrgyz, has been sent to detention camps for re-education. People who have a beard, quit smoking, or watch foreign religious TV programs can all be considered extremists and sent to the detention camps. Victims are asked to abandon their religious beliefs and declare allegiance to the CCP regime. Otherwise, they will be beaten or deprived of food and drink. Young Uyghurs post photos on social media of them smoking and drinking alcohol to look more Chinese in the hope to avoid being sent to camps. The repression is much more severe than other parts of China, but we, Marxists, warn that Xinjiang police methods can be spread to other areas, and we have already witnessed this during the COVID lockdowns. In Xinjiang, there is a mass surveillance system with racially specific technology that can identify Uyghur faces, the massive checking of ID cards and mobile phones by the police, and the mandatory installation of surveillance apps in the mobile phones. Uyghur households are forced to receive government officials who live in their homes usually at weekends. These intrusive home visits spread terror in case the official sees or hears something or is displeased in any way, and reports the family, meaning they are sent to the camps. Last year, retail giants, including H&M and Nike, signed a quite weak declaration against Uyghur forced labor in cotton production. In March this year, due to the escalation of the Cold War with the West, this old news about these companies was seized upon by the CCP to whip up a wave of nationalist backlashes in China, mainly on the internet. Also, the US, European Union, the UK, and Canada imposed token sanctions on senior Chinese officials over human rights abuses in Xinjiang. Of course, those big companies and West governments are using their pressure in Xinjiang to pressure the Chinese regime for their own economic and geopolitical interests. The capitalists have never done anything to support working class people in Xinjiang or China. The US, with its war on terror, aided and facilitated the CCP's crackdown in Xinjiang. Donald Trump told Xi Jinping in 2019 that he agreed that prison camps in Xinjiang were exactly the right thing to do. Nevertheless, the mass incarceration, forced labor, separation of children from their parents are all confirmed by official Chinese government documents and statistics. It would be blind and naive to imagine that this is all a hoax perpetrated by the CIA. Meanwhile, with the repression escalating, many Han Chinese residents have realized they are also victims of CCP rule. Also, last month, thousands of people in Chengdu joined the Mother's Call for transparency over a 16-year senior high school student's death at school. The student was said to have jumped to his death in the evening on 9th May by the Education Bureau, but many people doubted it is suicide. While the call for transparency by the thousands were suppressed by the police, it shows again that the authority cannot fool the public all the time. Despite the state repression, there are still resistances from below. Many counter-reforms can spark major unrest. Workers in China have tried to organize for basic rights. For example, delivery drivers called for a strike on 8th March after the arrest of a driver who formed an informal or independent union. In China, independent trade unions have always been outlawed. Workers and activists and strike organizers are arrested and jailed. Within CCP, there are power struggles. Xi's factional rivals are uneasy over the direction of the state. They think that Xi's authoritarian policies and nationalist wolf warrior foreign policies have gone too far and made unnecessary troubles. The latest example in the collapse of a big investment deal with the EU, which many see as an own goal caused by Xi Jinping's anti-Western diplomacy. This is a fear that he is too reckless. This will create a bigger backlash from other capitalist powers with its aggressive and militarist policies like in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Above all, there is fear his policies will create an internal backlash. In conclusion, the CCP dictatorship is sitting on the time bomb by continually doubling down on hardline repressive policies, while workers' conditions are getting worse. Xi's regime is creating an explosive future. The labor movement should not support any capitalist government or party. It has to be independent and trust only in the powers of the working class to struggle and organize solidarity. China is now an imperialist power which bosses over many economically weaker countries. It is the second most powerful imperialist country after the US. Socialists don't support either of these powers. We don't see a lesser evil. All imperialism needs to be fought. Chinese workers, women, and oppressed ethnic groups need support in their struggle against repression from workers and socialists around the world.
The situation in Hong Kong is that it is now a de facto police state, that the Chinese so-called communist dictatorship, it's absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with communism. It's a completely capitalist and reactionary regime. And this dictatorship has taken full control over Hong Kong in the last 12 months. Previously, there was a form of devolution. There was a form of local autonomy, political autonomy, but progressively, the CCP dictatorship is taking full control over the courts, the schools, the media, the civil service, and even the economy of Hong Kong, in a sense that the traditional Hong Kong capitalist tycoons have been a key ally of the CCP for the last 30 years, really since it carried through the return to capitalism in the 1980s and 90s. The traditional Hong Kong tycoons are now being squeezed out economically by mainland China capitalist groups. So what you have alongside the political repression, you have an aggressive economic colonization that's taking place of Hong Kong. And this is one of the features of Chinese imperialism, which is something that is crucial in this discussion to understand and keep up with what is happening in China, in Hong Kong, and how it fits in with the imperialist Cold War that is raging now internationally. This campaign, Solidarity Against Repression in Hong Kong and China, as Lance explained, this is a unique campaign for supporting workers' struggles in China and in Hong Kong, supporting the struggle for democratic rights, and supporting the work of Marxists and socialists who are also facing persecution, the risk of arrest, the risk of imprisonment in both China and Hong Kong. This campaign is to raise political awareness and to educate within the labor movement, to prepare the workers' movement to effectively resist the Cold War, which is escalating, the conflict between the US and China, that we have to have an understanding of what's happening in China. It's much more straightforward to follow what's happening in the US, because the media, for all its faults, the capitalist media, nevertheless, there's a certain diversity. But in China, there's a complete lockdown on the information that we can get out, apart from the information that comes from the underground and that comes from our own comrades who are following and interacting on the internet, which is the only forum for discussion or debate in China. In Hong Kong, since the national security law was imposed by China a year ago, around 100 political activists have been charged with offences under the national security law. The maximum penalty under this law is life imprisonment. Actually, it's not the maximum penalty. There's clauses in the law which allow, in serious cases, defendants to be tried in China. And in China, they could face the death penalty. Now, that's not been invoked up to now, but that threat is there. Now, in addition to these 100 who are facing the most serious charges, there are over 10,000, mostly young people in Hong Kong who've been arrested for political offences since the mass protest movement of 2019. These cases are coming before the courts all the time. Every week, every few days, there are new trials. 600 so far have been convicted from this wider group of 10,000 for offences, so-called, that were committed in 2019 in the course of the mass democracy struggle, which saw up to 2 million people taken to the streets. Now, many in this group of 600 that have been convicted have been sentenced to 5 years or more in prison. Extremely severe sentences for, in many cases, crimes that in no way could be construed as violent or not even peaceful. In most cases, they are just accused of unlawful assembly, of participating in protests that were not sanctioned by the police. Under the national security law, there is no longer trial by jury for these offences. Now, Hong Kong, due to its colonial past, has a so-called British judicial system. And trial by jury, well, it's not the most democratic of all reforms, but believe you me, there is a difference when you're facing a life sentence to being tried by a judge and being tried by a jury of your peers. This is now abolished for national security law offences. There is no bail or very little chance of getting bail. Now, previously in Hong Kong, you had to be a murderer or you had to commit a serious violent crime to be refused bail. But now the defendants in political trials are routinely refused bail. So, for example, long hair, Leung Kwo Kung, who was the only elected member of the previous legislature in Hong Kong, he was elected 5 times to the legislature and sat for over 15 years in that body. He's in prison since the end of February because he's been refused bail. He's actually not been convicted of any crime, but he's on trial under the national security law, along with 46 other defendants in what is the most important of the trials going on in Hong Kong at the moment. Most of the 47 were refused bail, and they've been behind bars for 3 months. The second hearing of their case was last week on Monday. And the most significant development, they were only in court for a day. The most significant development was that the prosecution, the government, proposed that the case should be transferred to the High Court. Now, what does that mean? The idea of transferring it to the higher court is for one reason and one reason only: life sentences. Because in the district court, in the lower courts, they don't have the power to sentence someone to lifetime imprisonment. Only the highest court can impose such a sentence. And that's what they're going for in this case. And it's therefore extremely likely that many, if not all of the 47 will receive the maximum sentence of lifetime in prison. And this is an absolutely grotesque so-called judicial process. This is a show trial worthy of Stalin's regime in the 1930s. Because the so-called crime was that they participated in an electoral primary a year ago to decide which candidates should go forward to the legislative election. That election was then postponed, was cancelled, and now that legislature no longer exists. It's been killed off by the regime and replaced by a zombie legislature, whereby previously it was not a paragon of democracy. In the old legislature, only 50% of the places were elected on the basis of one person, one vote. And 50% were appointed from different government bodies and capitalist interest groups. Now, that has been redesigned so that only 1 in 5 of the seats will be elected by the voters as a whole. And 4/5 of the seats will be appointed by the CCP, by its puppet bodies in Hong Kong, and by different capitalist interest groups. And all of the candidates to the new legislature will be vetted by the equivalent of MI5. Imagine if that was proposed in the UK, that, you know, the candidates for your elections to Westminster first had to be approved by the MI5 before they could go forward. This system is described by the CCP and its apologists as ensuring that patriots rule Hong Kong, that we don't want unpatriotic elements, such as the pro-democracy fighters, such as people like Longhair, being elected into the parliament. In this case, the word patriot simply means those who are slavish followers of Xi Jinping and don't criticize his repression. Now, Hong Kong is, of course, not the worst case in terms of repression. It's worse in mainland China. Workers routinely have their strikes smashed by the police. Workers, activists, those who organize strikes, are arrested and imprisoned. Left-wing youth who support workers' protests are arrested and imprisoned. Some of these youth call themselves Maoists. It's a very broad term in China. There's been a huge growth of radicalization of youth in China and a movement towards the left and towards left ideas, towards socialism. It's a very progressive development in this situation. Many of them call themselves Maoists for historical or traditional reasons, but actually when you discuss with them, they're not like Maoists, as Maoists that you would meet, for example, occasionally, very occasionally, in some countries in Western Europe or in North America, because the Maoists in China are in favor of LGBT rights. They're positive towards feminism. They regard the CCP, as we do, as a capitalist regime. They want to overthrow the CCP. So in other words, this is not classical Maoism. Nevertheless, some of these youth have been involved in helping workers to organize strikes. They've been rounded up, they've been imprisoned or disappeared. They face the same repression. So some misguided left groups or individuals in countries like the UK could think, well, surely we should give some kind of support to China in the conflict with the US, because the US is the most dangerous enemy. It's the biggest imperialist power. And surely China stands for some kind of radical alternative. Well, it doesn't. It's a capitalist government. It's an imperialist government. And in terms of the rights of the working class and the rights of the left, it's a viciously repressive government. Lance mentioned the delivery drivers. They've organized strikes in the last few months in China. There are 7 million food delivery drivers in China. The kind of equivalent, I guess, what's it called in the UK, like Deliveroo, or I don't know what it is. But anyway, they ride around on motorbikes delivering pizzas, except in China, they don't deliver so many pizzas. These workers, 7 million of them, it's a gig economy. They have no contracts. 15% of them have a university degree, because students, graduates from the universities can't get other work, and therefore they're recruited into this army of gig workers like the food delivery drivers. And when they tried to organize strikes earlier this year, their alleged leader, Chen Guojing, was arrested on the 25th of February, and he's still in prison. And we're campaigning in the Solidarity Against Repression in China and Hong Kong campaign. We're also campaigning for his release and for the right of workers to form independent trade unions, the right to strike in China, which doesn't exist. China, with 850 million workers, is the biggest non-union workforce in the world. And these are issues that need to be addressed when people misguidedly believe that China somehow has some kind of left or radical government. June the 4th, last Friday, that was the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. Mass movement in China in 1989, very important movement. Really, it was a turning point. When that movement was defeated, it removed the last obstacle to China going back to capitalism. 1,000 or more were killed. It's a state secret. We don't know how many were actually killed, but the number is almost certainly over 1,000 that were massacred by the PLA with the tanks and live ammunition on the night of June the 3rd, June the 4th, 1989. Now, it's been commemorated every year in Hong Kong, the vigil in Hong Kong. I had some nice photos to show you the vigil, but unfortunately the screen share mechanism is apparently not available. Now, it was banned this year in Hong Kong. Not only was it banned, the last time it was held, 2019, before the pandemic, there was 180,000 in Hong Kong that turned out for the annual Tiananmen Square vigil on June the 4th. It was an incredible manifestation. This year, for the second year running, it was banned, again using the COVID pandemic as a pretext. But the difference this year, they made it quite clear that if people tried to get into the park, disobeying the ban, they would be violating the national security law. The police went out in advance and they said that if you participate in the demonstration on Friday, the 4th of June, you're going to risk 5 years imprisonment. And if you promote it on your social media, if you put a post on Facebook calling for people to demonstrate, it's 1 year in prison. That's the kind of draconian repression which is now being meted out. Now, it's incredible that in this situation where the official organizer of the vigil, the Alliance, as it's called in Hong Kong, it's a kind of grouping of different NGOs and liberal parties that every year honor the memory of the people that were killed in 1989. They depoliticize the event. For many years, we've been critical about the way they organize the annual Tiananmen vigil. Instead of linking it to today's struggle, they just turn it into kind of a ceremony with songs and remembrance and kind of depoliticize it. But the organizers of the vigil, the Alliance, they did not resist the ban. They did not even organize an online meeting on Friday as a defiance of the ban. So what you have is a situation where the official parties and groups of the democracy struggle, in many cases, are showing no resistance to the repression. But what happened on Friday, which has not been widely reported, in Hong Kong is quite incredible, because despite this severe ban and repression, and despite the lack of leadership, up to 60,000 people, mostly young people, turned out in defiance of the ban. They went to the areas and the streets around the park. There were 7,000 police surrounding the park where the vigil is held every year to keep them out. And it led to impromptu demonstrations. And it was an incredible sight, because the police were arresting people initially for having candles. The police did not expect that 60,000 people would turn out in defiance of their threats. And in many cases, people didn't have the candles, but they used their mobile phones. They switched on the torches on their mobile phones. So you had the streets packed with people, thousands of people with their phones on, shining a light in defiance of the regime. Now, this is an extremely interesting development, because the youth then began to march and chant slogans. Now, it wasn't about 1989. It wasn't about what happened in Beijing 32 years ago. The slogans were about the situation now, because what's, if you like, relevant to the youth in particular in Hong Kong, it's not what happened in China 3 decades ago, but is the attempt of the police to ban demonstrations. It was a spontaneous mobilization to defend the right of assembly in Hong Kong. And the slogans reflected that. Now in China, you can no longer say end one party rule. If you say that, and that's been part of our program, and every other organization that stands for democratic rights would agree with that, would have had that as a slogan over the last 30 or so years. You can't say it because you'd be violating the national security law. But another slogan that's illegal, and you can be arrested and you can be sentenced to life imprisonment, is to call for Hong Kong independence. And yet the youth on the streets in Hong Kong, many of them were calling for Hong Kong independence, and they were chanting other Hong Kong slogans like 5 demands and not one less. That's a reference to the 5 demands of the 2019 movement. So in other words, what happened spontaneously, this mobilization, it's an indication of the difficulties the Chinese regime is going to have in tightening its control and establishing its full control over Hong Kong. That doesn't mean they're going to stop. One of the factors that is pushing them forward is the Cold War with the US. And that means that the Chinese regime is now facing a really severe pressures. The Cold War did not abate with Trump. And we warned that that would be the case. We said that Biden is going to continue Trump's Cold War policies and even escalate. And that's exactly what's happened. Biden is now heading for Europe. And it's an extremely important visit. It's his first overseas visit as president. He's coming to England for the G7 meeting. He's going to attend an EU-US summit, and he's going to attend a NATO meeting. And the connecting thread of all these meetings is China. They're actually saying that Biden's visit is about the 3 C's: COVID, climate, and China. But actually, 2 of the C's are really about China. The COVID discussion is also about China. The climate is also about China. At the G7 meeting that Boris Johnson is going to host now this weekend, they're apparently going to launch an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative, a green alternative. Well, I think it will be extremely weak on substance. But what they're clearly trying to do now is push back against China's Belt and Road Initiative with their own counter program for imperialist loans and influence in Africa, in Asia, and in other parts of the world, and using a green climate-friendly profile. Because China's expansion, they're saying, this is one figure I'll give before I wind up, that there is estimates that the Belt and Road Initiative, this is this mega infrastructure plan with 140 countries under China's leadership, that this project alone will increase global average temperatures by 2.7 centigrade. In other words, it will smash the Paris Climate Agreement target, and it will tip the world into irreversible climate change. Just the Belt and Road Initiative by itself. This has given a handle to the US and Western imperialism to attack China on the question of the Belt and Road and to push back. And there are other features of Biden's visit in the next few days to the UK, which are extremely important from the point of view of this Cold War competition. It's escalating. And when it escalates, what does China do? It uses Hong Kong as a punch bag. It uses Hong Kong to show, well, we control Hong Kong, and this is what we can do, and you can't stop us. And that is the logic, really, of what's taking place at the present time. There are other points that I wanted to make in relation to Taiwan, in relation to the new huge bill that's been voted through the US Congress today, which is for stepped up economic competition with China. But I'll leave my remarks there.